hear me? Yes? Okay. Good afternoon to the few of you that stay here before lunch. It's a pleasure for me to lead this part of the conference today, which will be on the challenges of the digital agriculture during the Finance of Commons Summit. So digital agriculture has shown during COVID-19 a huge impact and a huge effect over how we do agri-food system transformation and how we look at the rural sector. So it's very nice to have a session dedicated to that. And we have a keynote speaker, which is Martin F. Kenney, Distinguished Professor of Community and Regional Development from the University of California, Davis. So Martin, you will have 15 minutes to do your presentation, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Because Hans has to leave, I thought he was going to speak first, but of course I can go.
I think it will be Hans, because one of the things that we wanted to look is what are the challenges, although it will be ideal to hear the presentation, but all of you have the paper, which will be shared also to your QAR. So Hans, if you want to tell us a little bit about where you see digital agriculture revolution will be inclusive of smallholders or if it won't be. So what are the challenges for smallholders, for inclusivity of smallholders, given that you have to leave at 1 p.m.?
Thanks, Maximo. Anyways, thanks for inviting FMO and myself to this forum. I mean, it's of course fascinating what has happened over the last few years on the agri-tech revolution. FMO is a Dutch development bank. We have been financing, investing food and agribusiness in developing countries already for several years. AgTech has been really a new activity, and it has been organized in the equity department. And that's important because what we normally do is mostly debt, but AgTech, because it's innovative, because it's new, it's typically an equity instrument. How to make sure that it's inclusive? What we see in countries like India, Africa is very interesting. Supply chain platforms connecting to thousands and thousands of farmers. So from the face of it, I think it is inclusive. There's lots of benefits that I see for smallholders that maybe in the past were not well integrated, not well connected to the market, to inputs, to knowledge. And through these initiatives, through these platforms, they suddenly, in a very short time, have been connected to the digital world and to the real world. Because I think AgTech or digitalization is not a panacea. To me, it's a very important instrument, but you still need the logistics, you still need the infrastructure, regulatory framework. Who owns this data? I think that is still work in progress, and it's very, very, very difficult, I think. But even if that's not perfect, the whole ownership discussion, I think the advantages for farmers and also smaller farmers are still, I think, justifying some of the disadvantages, as I see it. Now, there was a question like, can it be economies of scale neutral? And that's an interesting one, because if I look into practical cases, for example, there is one case, it's called Twiga. Twiga is probably the most famous AgTech platform in Kenya. It's very much focused on the retail, on connecting farmers, horticulture farmers to street vendors. It's a very nice initiative. Even Goldman Sachs invested in it. So apparently, it's interesting. But when they make promotion to get new farmers, 2 years ago, they said ideally we need farmers with 50 acres of land. So that's quite big, of course, even for Kenya. So it shows to me that also in these supply chain platforms, economies of scale cannot be fully ruled out. Because every step in the chain that you add to aggregate, for example, adds cost. Also there, but still, even I think it can be great for smallholders. Maybe one point to mention, which is important to me, I come from a bank called Rabobank, which basically did a lot in in the Netherlands to access to finance for small farmers 100 years ago. I think what you now see in AgTech is that for the first time, farmers are building their digital records. In the past, they didn't have maybe ID, they didn't have records, banks typically left them out. Now you see, because of the digitalization, they can build up digital records on agri-production, on their income, and that really helps connecting them to fintech, to banks, because through credit scoring, in a relatively low-cost way, you can finance smaller farmers. This also poses a risk because there's a big risk of over-crediting in this market. And that's I see as a main disadvantage. In fintech, in the microfinance atmosphere, there has been a lot of problems with over-crediting. It's relatively easy probably to connect as a farmer to maybe 3 platforms. So that I think it's important that there's regulation and that we as DFIs take our own responsibility also to make sure that that these platforms have a serious approach to client protection principles and to protect those smaller farmers. So yeah, a bit about the advantages and the disadvantages.
Thank you, Hans. But given that you have to leave, let me torture you a little bit. So you refer to fintech and digital and risk scoring. Do you know of any good experience in which risk scoring has worked out for smallholders with digital technologies?
I can mention an example that Banque Populaire de Rwanda, BPR. I was involved in that myself a few years ago. That we launched a product based on farmer credit scorecards, which was successful at that time. I don't know, it's already a few years ago. Other successful examples, I know there's a big one called DigiFarm. It's launched by Safaricom. There are it's in Kenya, there are 1.5 million smallholders are connected to it, and they work with, they call them contract farmers. So if you produce a marketable product with existing buyers, what they do is they connect you to the buyer, and there's like a sort of tripartite scheme, and the loan, etc. is repayments directly deducted from the proceeds, the sales proceeds. I think that's a good one for small farmers to make sure there's like a closed cycle. I don't know very much about this in detail, but it sounds like a good platform and could be feasible.
No, thank you very much, and apologies we were delayed and you have to leave now, but we can keep, of course, in contact. Thank you so much. Let me now move back to our original program. So let me start with Professor Kenney. So Professor Kenney, if you can do a brief presentation in 10, 12 minutes, that will be ideal so that then we can start the discussion. Thank you.
Good. So I have a set of slides. Will they be up?
Yes, they should be up.
I can see them. They said they would be.
They will be. They are there.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm speaking for a group of us that are doing research on this, the University of California. And can I have the next slide, please? Good. Digitalization and platformization are inexorable. They're going to happen. We know this, right? And the entire agri-food system, from the consumer back to the agriculture input makers, are going to be tied together. And I think one of the key questions here is who will extract the value from the data? Because at the same time the products are being produced and going through the system, data is being generated. And data can generate value. And what will be the role of platform firms? We already see platform firms like Amazon, Tencent in China. We already see the power of these firms in their systems, right? And how can the public sector investors ensure a more equitable outcomes? Can I go to the next slide, please? Okay, so what are the things we need to think about here? First of all, agriculture is very complicated. All crops are different. All crops have different industrial structure. The same crop in different national structure and cultures are different, right? So this makes it quite complex to think about, how one platform will unite everything. The other thing we need to think about is, particularly in the developed world, but also in the developing world, farmers are not B2C, they're B2B. They're businesses, right? So that means they're going to have a very different perspective on their data versus the consumer on Amazon, the consumer on Facebook, the Google user. There are many challenges, right? Farmers are the weakest actors in the agri-food system. They have biological processes that are hard to control. Weather, we know all of this. Input challenges. Here in the United States now, labor availability in agriculture is really a huge problem. Of course, energy costs, all the other costs. And they have this very interesting aspect, which is when they have excellent results, bumper crops, the price goes down, and so they have a problem. Digital technologies, there's so many technologies. I just list a few of them. Well, what's interesting about this? And then on the side, on the right-hand side, I have a picture of the whole system being digitized. And how will all of that communication be put together, and who will control that, right? So all of these technologies have their own trajectories, each of them, cloud computing, QR codes, etc. So it's very confusing and difficult to figure out what the future is going to be, because all of these are changing at the same time and evolving and becoming better and better. May I have the next slide, please? So we know the enormous benefits possible in the developed and developing world. Increased food production, volume, greater efficiency, improved traceability, closer connection to the customer, therefore potentially lower food miles, better market fit, as Hans described that very briefly. The sustainable development goals. Digitization can lead to decreased chemical and irrigation usage, precision agriculture. Soil erosion can address these issues. Social issues, higher farm income. The farmer income is really critical, both in the developed world and the developing world, which could alleviate poverty and contribute to equity. So the digital technological revolution can contribute to all of our sustainable development goals. Please, next slide. Good. So digitalization and efficiency is our first concern, yet we have to consider power, because digitalization and new technologies shift power relationships, right? So Hans mentioned scale. What does this mean for scale? And if you have a platform, the platform owner can structure actions, observe all the actors, unilaterally change parameters, exclude actors, extract value, and subsidize actors. And one of the things we know about platforms is for platform entry, you subsidize. But then when you control the market, it becomes winner take most, winner take all, then you extract value, right? This is across all platforms. So as we think about platforms, we have to think about what will not only it be today, but what will it evolve to when the platform becomes dominant? Next slide, please. So who are the players in this platform world? And it depends on the countries, depends on the economies, it depends on the product involved, the crop. But we have all of the incumbent agro input firms entering: Bayer, John Deere, Komatsu, Kubota, etc., all thinking about how their machines can extract value and transform themselves into a platform. Right? I mean, read the Harvard Business Review. That's what businesses are being advised to do. We have the incumbent cooperatives, right? They're thinking about how can they platformize their cooperative members. Then we have, of course, venture capital funded startups, at least 2,000 in ag tech. I'm talking about the digital part of ag tech. And they're in every country, 70, 80 in Brazil, Nigeria, all over the world. Which of those will be successful? If they're successful, will they remain independent or will they be bought by John Deere or Bayer, et cetera, et cetera? So the other thing about sharing data on a platform is who owns the platform. If it's a startup, today may not be who owns it tomorrow. We've already seen that over and over and over. We've seen new multi-stakeholder entities. For example, the Netherlands Smart Dairy Project, where you bring the farmers, you bring the co-ops, you bring local government together to build a platform that has all of the actors involved, all the stakeholders involved. And that seems to me to be a way of thinking about going in the future rather than potentially just a private platform because of the power relationships. Then we have to think about what is the government's role here. Should the government be involved? Should the government own it? Should the government control it? How should the government regulate it? All of these things will be critical as we move towards platforms to organize sectors of agriculture or sectors of the agri-food system as a whole. Next slide, please. So what are the issues specific to developing countries' smallholder agriculture? Next slide. So in developing countries' smallholder agriculture, this was already alluded to. You have inadequate telecommunications service and investment in telecom. Low levels still of smartphone penetration. Country like China, it's very high, but obviously in Africa, it's still low, but of course it's going up. We have disparate, incompatible operating systems. So try building a platform or a digital service in Africa, and you have different flavors of Android for it because very few iOS products, Apple products there. You have extreme risk aversion, right? Because they're so close to the edge. And you have low prices for products, many intermediaries. These can be disintermediated, but as you disintermediate intermediaries, they no longer have a place in the system. So they're now out of work. So these are very difficult problems to deal with. And then recall all the problems I mentioned earlier about agriculture. It's even worse for smallholder agriculture. So these can determine the limits to acceptance and how it is accepted, what is accepted. Next slide, please. And some concluding thoughts. Next slide, please. So, questions about the future. Value extraction by the platform. If a platform is successful and we know the efficiencies that a platform can bring, will the platform become a value extraction machine as Amazon is today? Anybody who reads about sellers on Amazon will understand that the value is increasingly being extracted from it. Digitalization and labor displacement. Is that an issue? In California, it's becoming less and less of an issue because we have such terrible labor shortages in agriculture. Is that the same in developing countries? Commercial versus smallholder agriculture, right? If you're going to go to 50 hectares in Kenya, well then maybe this is no longer exactly smallholder agriculture and it's a transformation to commercial agriculture. And digitalization may drive that. That's not necessarily bad, but one would need to plan for it. And then what is the role of public funding to ensure that public funding results in enduring benefits to farmers and the public, not just to the private sector? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Good. So investment bank considerations. Well, first of all, I think multi-stakeholder strategies are preferable. In many cases, public investors should retain a golden share to mitigate the risks down the road as the platform starts, for example, becomes privatized. Explore a variety of models in developed countries, how to connect farmers to markets, aggregate data to improve productivity and sustainable development goals. Perhaps the developing countries, it's similar, but infrastructure is going to be more vital there. Hans referred to logistics, for example, where we have pretty good logistics in the developed countries into the ag sector. We don't in many developing countries. Next slide, please. So we have to address the digital divide, which still remains both in the developed world, but less and less in the developed world, but particularly in the developed world. You have to think about it in the developing world. Are you going to provide low-cost standardized smartphones? How are you going to monetize that? And with GPS, right? GPS is going to be critical because in all of agriculture, location is so important. Location in the field, et cetera, location of your animals, right? Are we going to talk about subsidized data plans? Data is expensive in the developing world. It's somewhat expensive in the developed world, but in the developing world. So you have to think about subsidized data plans, outreach, educational programs. So as digitalization comes, it's going to have to come as a package, I think, in many cases. Build logistics systems that contribute to the social good, right? Not logistics systems that allow monopolization and therefore, again, extraction of value. And then one has to think, what is so key about the digital technologies? Gain of function. Think about what Google does today versus what Google did 10 years ago. What the Amazon platform does today versus what it did 10 years ago. Again, these development trajectories, all of these digital technologies are gaining function. Add AI, add in more data, more ability to link different databases together. As you invest, you have to think about the gain of function that will happen. It's baked in the cards. It's what's happening in the digital technologies generally over the last 30 years. It's going to continue to happen. Next slide, please. Okay, so public investors can help shape the future, but avoid a future where a few platforms or one platform controls and extracts value from the other actors in the agri-food system. So in many respects, today we're talking about in many countries, including the developed countries, building platforms that may have an incumbency and give the public a voice in the further evolution. So help fund platforms that support social good rather than private wealth and I could slash data extraction. Am I done or can I? The slide has disappeared on my screen.
It's back.
It's back. Oh, okay, I can't see. Oh, there it is. Good. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kenney. And if you would like, please stay with us. We will go through some questions and answers, and I will be happy to involve you in that, given that we lost Hans at this point. So let me say that I think you raised very important issues, the issue of connectivity, of course, which is central and is part of the issue of digital divide, the issue of the content and also capabilities, no? How people can connect. But there is also the issue of the labor market and how the labor market will change because of automation, which is based on digital technologies, and that's extremely important. But on the other hand, you raise this issue that the agricultural sector is one of the most complex ones, but has shown to be one of the most resilient ones during COVID-19. It's one of the few sectors where everything kept moving, and even trade increased as a result of COVID-19. So it's a very interesting sector, challenging sector, with a lot of risks, but not necessarily huge risk aversion. Of course, the smaller you are, the more disconnected to the market are, your risk aversion goes up, as you correctly mentioned. But let me go back to our panelists, and we have two additional panelists. It's Pasquale de Muro, Professor of Corporate Social Responsibility and Sustainability at University degli Studi in Roma 3. Welcome, Professor Pasquale. And Michiko Katagami, Principal Agricultural and Natural Resources Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. So let's go back to the question that we have. So how digital agriculture revolution will be inclusive of smallholders or SMEs, no? Because in the agri-food systems, you have also a lot of SMEs and micro enterprises. And how it can be economies of scale neutral. And that's a very complex issue, which I think Professor Kenney referred to when he was talking about the platforms, no? So let me start with Pasquale. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate very much reading the paper of Professor Kenney. I think an excellent work, insightful and very useful for a policy discussion. How this process can be made inclusive as possible. I think there are several different actions that we can imagine. And in the paper, there are a number of suggestions made by Professor Kenney. I want to just discuss about one aspect that I think is very important. As is written in the paper, for poor farmers, the possibility of implementing solutions depends mostly on their capabilities. So I think that this is a very crucial point in the process. And I think that in order to have an inclusive process of digitalization or platformization, I think that these basic capabilities of the poorest farmers should be enhanced. And if you look at the poorest rural areas in the developing world, you know that basic education currently is very, very low, or even zero, and mean years of schooling is something below 5, so that is below primary. And I think that with such a large mass of non-educated people, grasping these opportunities for these uneducated people is much difficult. So I think that is more difficult, sorry. So I think that we cannot think about inclusive digitalization if we don't think also about how to boost basic education in those poorest areas. Basic education, not only technical education about digital economy or technology. We need basic education because the medium between these people and the way they catch these opportunities is precisely their basic capabilities in terms of understanding the role and the possibility given by technology. So basic education is important. And in rural areas, especially for women, this is an obstacle. So I think that there is room for investment in rural areas in terms of education. And also improving the quality of education, because digitalization should be in the curricula of primary education, in order that people, once they finish primary education, they have a clear idea of this type of technology and the possibilities. So digital education and digitalization agriculture go together. So I think that this is a great opportunity. Also because there is a huge gap between basic education in rural areas and in urban areas. So if we don't fill this gap, I don't think that digitalization, can be inclusive. And this is, I think, a very important point. And of course, we are speaking about a public good, because basic education is a public good. So there is an important role for governments, but also for public banks, for development banks, and also for civil society organization.
Thank you so much. Let me now pass to our next speaker, Michiko. What are your views? They already have referred to capabilities, no? The issue of education and how to try to break that barrier. But that could take generations. So what other ideas you have? Is correct, it's something that we need to do, but what do we do in the short term?
Thank you, Maximo. This is an interesting discussion so far. It's a really unusual topic because I tell you why. Asia is full of smallholder farmers, and most of our investment that we make annually, about $2 billion from the sovereign loan and grants, and also the private sector investment, about $500 million a year. It's all about supporting the smallholder farmers and get them connect to the viable value chains or markets. And we have a high expectation actually starting utilizing the agri-tech services. And we're not really doing this public sector within this. It's just we formulated the co-investment with the service providers, government, in our projects. And then they're the smallholders buyers, put them together and make all this business things works. Because we're living in the area where, the world where there's so efficient in terms of transaction of this value chain. And most of the farmers are not linked to the market. I'll tell you, for example, in India, 95% of the farmers are, the farm sort of production, the distribution is handled by the middleman, informal sector is very inefficient and changing hands 5 or 6 times until you reach the consumers. Expensive, transaction in terms of natural use management, and it's not really giving any of this business opportunity for the smallholders. So what we are utilizing the digital agriculture in that sphere is the direct link to the market, and it's make them make the better money out of this. We also even had the venture, ADB Venture, who is actually taking equity position in some of the promising services. So I know we are biased, but we pick only the inclusive technology that will work for the smallholder farmers. And we're doing that, picking that from the sort of, in that sort of sandbox, the environment where our project, the public sector project, provides the value chain development with the multiple stakeholders being the cooperatives and their buyers and all the government and the service providers and negotiate how the promising that the benefits can be utilized in generated in that environment. And if it's promising, we just try it out, evaluate, and upscale. That kind of sandbox system is that we're doing that, right now as an operation. But there's a scary thought when after reading your paper, Professor Kenney, what if that 95% all digitized overnight? And we know the presence of these big platform players on Amazon, all these the Chinese ones, and all present in Asia, but they're not that dominant power. But what if the 95% digital? It's a scary thought. It's something that we really have to start thinking about maybe. But they're scaling to a certain extent. It's necessary to make business out of agriculture for smallholders. I'll stop here. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. So what we understand, and I think everybody agrees, is that digital technology is reduced to resolve market failures. It will shorten the value chain. It will give information that will allow to make better decisions, connect to markets, as you were referring. We can use blockchains for traceability, artificial intelligence to even manage and predict better prices through sentiment analysis and so on. But the point here is that it has a component of natural monopoly, the supply of these technologies. And that requires potential concentration at the beginning, and that's the linkage to the platform. Not only that, it has a lot of potential to create joint products where you transfer market power from one sector to the other. And that's linked to mobile money, for example, where basically cellular phones are also doing mobile money and also doing financing. So they're transferring their market power. So what we should do to avoid this? Because there are several ways. You can create new institutions, and developed countries has done that. The European Union has a great regulatory agency. Or we have to do certain types of interventions. One example is the Cancer Gene Bank Atlas, for example, which brought all these innovations in cancer genomics and make it public to everybody, and that has created a huge leapfrog in terms of solutions of cancer in the world. So the question to all of you, and including here Professor Kenney, what type of institutions are needed to assure there is no further concentration of the agriculture in few giant platforms or giant firms, and how this also applies to big data, which is another problem we are facing, where again you are linking technology and innovation in technology to privacy of the data. So companies are capturing the information of the farmers, which gives them a huge asset to assess how they can benefit from it, and not even providing it back to public. So what we should do? So let me start with Professor Kenney. Please, only 2.5 minutes, because we have to finish at 1:30.
Okay. Well, I mean, you've put your finger on it, and I think, first of all, we need to start experimentation. And I think, the development banks, you have funds that you could start to experiment. Just to give a silly idea, if you look at today, Italy, there are so many different platforms to connect, let's say, local farmers and the city, whatever city they're close to. There are many private sector platforms. There's no winner yet. Could the Public Development Bank build some sort of platform that these different cities and farmers could come onto to create a uniform, in some way, way of connecting people that would not be part of a value extraction process, but would try to keep the value within the two, let's say, the consumer and the farmer, right? So you could imagine private sector platforms, but they don't seem to be succeeding yet, not like Amazon did in the other sectors. So could one consider some sort of public sector? Could you consider multi-stakeholders? So the Dutch have developed for the dairy farming, they're experimenting with multi-stakeholder platforms by which the data could be aggregated, but the farmer could also win as part of that process. Because so many cases, let's aggregate the data, but the farmer's not going to get anything for the data. I think these are the kinds of experiments that we can look at, and that the public development banks as investors, as venture capital investors, could start to create these platforms and then find ways to monetize them. Because the other thing about the VCs in this platform world is they're willing to lose money on a platform for 3, 4, 5 years until it sort of takes and roots in. And then, of course, then you try to capitalize it. So there, I think, could the investment banks be like venture capitalists, but for the good of all the actors in that particular system. So those are the kinds of things that I would look at if I was a public investment bank. I would look at the VCs, but I'm not sure that I would adopt the VC model, which is in a sense extraction and then exit, right, to the stock market, when then the extraction of all the other sides of the platform starts. Right?
Thank you.
As Amazon is doing
thank you very much, Professor Kenney. Let me pass now to Pasquale.
So another point, oh, sorry.
No, it's okay now.
I think that another point that I found in the paper that is very relevant for this question is the role of collective action. I appreciate very much the importance that Professor Kenney gave to collective action. Precisely in order to avoid more concentration, collective action is an important role, because as producer organizations and cooperatives and other types of collective actors may join their forces in order to get, for instance, better prices. Okay, normally they succeed in having better market conditions. At the same time, they can have, for instance, they can join their forces and create collective action in order to having their own platforms, their own digital tools, and this can democratize the cyberspace. So I think that collective action has a very important role to play, because it's not a top-down action like from governments, but is a bottom-up action that can also bring a new and important alternatives to traditional competitors that already are there. So I think that, and in fact, there are a few examples already of cooperatives that are being organized in this way. So I think that the collective action has an important role also in this cyberspace, and I think that the governments should, and international banks should support the efforts made by producer organizations and cooperatives in order to create new spaces, new cyberspaces for this economic democracy.
Thank you so much. And Michiko, Asia has a huge experience on regulation. Korea is the golden product in terms of regulation of telecommunications. So what is your experience as Asia Development Bank on this topic?
Well, first of all, I want to highlight the importance of this collective actions. The cooperatives is so important. We going back to the massive investment, turn them into a membership-owned entity that would engage in a commercial value chain. This is a little bit different from what we've been doing for the cooperative development, and that institutional investment itself is the way to go in terms of take up of the technology and make it into the fight against all this commercial competitive world. And then there's a very good example happening on the ground in some of the countries, and that's really encouraging. One of the things about the platform, we've been doing this, Professor Kenney, and it's multiple things, companies come together, especially after the COVID. The food retailers, processors, and also logistics people, and farmers cooperatives, and the governments. It was really swiftly worked together. We did the prototype of things in last year, and it was very, very successful. But when it comes to try to just look at, okay, so try to proper business proposition for everybody to come in to make a good platform, even just for a year to run. It's really, really controversial. And then there's a lot of failure stories. And right now, I don't have a success story to talk about. But maybe give us another year. Maybe we'll come up with this the success story, the seed of success story. Maybe we can come up with. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Let me be finally very provocative to all of you. So, in my experience in this topic, I have been working this topic for more than 15 years now, and have traveled around the world, especially in developing countries. So the accessibility is one of the major problems, is the broadband access. So we have $600 and something billion in SDRs, and we can allocate 20 or 30% of those and provide basically access to broadband to most of the poorest developing countries, so they can be part of that. The capability issue worries me, but doesn't worry too much, because in my experience, kids which are at school will help their parents. They will find a solution. They will create a short circuit to the problem and resolve the problem. Content could be also a bigger problem, no? The quality of the information behind. But let's assume that we can do this investment. You don't think that the technology will evolve itself and there will be tons of startups to create this collective action in the rural areas and will resolve part of this issue? You don't think this could be the biggest constraint? So in 50 seconds, if you can give me your opinion on this. So let me start with Michiko first.
I want to see that happen, thanks. I believe in that would happen. But we have to start this to accelerate that initiation.
Pasquale? You're muted.
Speaking about short-term solutions.
Can you repeat, please?
I think that this issue is a long-term issue, it's a developing issue. We cannot have short-term solutions for this problem.
Perfect. Professor Kenney?
Well, I think the startups, when I look at the world, I see many, many startups, and I see none of them getting that much traction in the agricultural world. Hans gave some examples. I can give you other examples. This little thing here, this little thing in Africa, 50,000 people connected, 100,000 people connected. I think that won't work. That's not working in Italy to connect consumers with farmers, because they're so small. So I think some way of aggregating them together, bringing some sort of common platform that everybody can sit on, is probably more likely than a bunch of startups, because it looks to me like right now, we're just seeing a lot of startups, a boom of where capital is being thrown around kind of wildly. So I think the development banks can be catalysts, can potentially bring broader solutions to a country rather than bit by bit. But I think that has to be worked out. We have to think that through. I don't think we've thought it through yet. But that's what I believe. I don't think this startup phenomenon of just tens of thousands of startups not going anywhere, just throwing capital, is working right now. But I could be wrong.
Okay, no, thank you very much to all of you. We are on our time now, 1:30, 1:32. So I think there has been an interesting discussion, because if I follow what you say at the end, economies of scale are not neutral, clearly. And seems that we have to do something else to break that need of economies of scale. Because in agriculture, of course, aggregation matters. And we need to find ways to keep the standards. For example, food safety standards require certain type of investment. Although it still is my belief that in the world of digital technologies, if we are able to resolve the problem of connectivity, the startups could end being a new Yahoo, a new Google. Just look at what happened a few days ago, a few weeks ago, when WhatsApp stopped for only one day or less than a day, for a few hours. Tons of new mechanisms appear in 1 second. It was incredible to see the evolution. So again, it's a way of thinking a little bit different, but I fully agree there is a lot of complexity here. We need to keep working, and we need to find ways how we can create these common pool resources and de-risking, which could be a huge role for these banks to try to attract the needed investment for the transformation that we need. Thank you so much to the three of you, and it has been a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.